Hello and welcome to episode 229 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we are talking about CDL Major 3 Week 1 qualifier matches. The CDL is back after a 2.5-week break following Major 2. Rosters are different, teams are different, maps are different. But I think there are some things that have stayed the same, some things that are, I think, pretty different, at least through 1 week of Major 3 qualifier action. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Yeah, doing all right. Like you said, we got a taste of the new maps, new meta, some new rosters, all that good stuff this week. It was still a week of online COD though, so it is what it is. But I think it was a pretty good breath of fresh air to get some of that new life into the matches, if you will, through all the changes over the recent break. So should have some good stuff to talk about today.
First thing we should talk about is the Carolina Royal Ravens. We already discussed their roster change on the last episode. They officially welcomed in Fire 40, replacing Nero, who they had previously released. But something new came out of this, and we've talked about the Bush and how they've been very active and by far more open about the inner workings of the challengers to CDL pipeline than anybody else in the scene, especially with their negotiations with the Boston breach a month or so ago, and how that was not necessarily that pleasant. And they revealed on their the Quick Fix podcast, and they talked about the process of moving Fire from the Bush to Carolina, and Jersey Jerry revealed in that episode that Carolina did not pay the buyout for Fire. Despite trialing him, he was reportedly one of 3 players that they trialed, including Kenny and Gio as well. And they, of course, picked Fire in that after that trial period, but didn't want to pay for him for whatever reason. I could imagine the reason, but they haven't come out and said. And so instead, Fire committed to paying for his own buyout to return to the CDL after multiple years away. What do you think about that? I certainly have my opinions on this, and I texted you, when I responded to your text about it. But how do you kind of view this situation, and do you think this might become more common in the CDL with teams just being like, hey, if we don't have to, we're not going to pay?
Well, I really hope it doesn't become more common, but um, I think I have a strong idea of what you're gonna say, and I'll leave that to you. But in terms of the big picture ramifications from this, I mean, first and foremost, I feel really bad for Fire that we outlined it over these past couple episodes when we've talked about him and his situation. Like, essentially, this is a very simplified summary of it, but essentially Fire just had to pay his own buyout to get back into the CDL for the first time in like 5+ years. And that just sucks for him, especially the way he's played this year. Like, feel like you have played well enough to earn a spot in the CDL, but in fact he had to buy his way into the CDL for lack of a better way of describing it. Like, it's just unfortunate that that's the way it went, but at the end of the day, you can look at it from an optimistic point of view and be like, Fire is willing to invest in himself and give himself the opportunity to compete in the CDL again and show that he belongs. And that does, in a sense, put more emphasis and pressure on his performances with Carolina now in terms of making sure he goes out and does his thing and shows that this money he spent on his own buyout was worthwhile in terms of potentially ensuring his future in the league beyond this season. Um, in terms of the Bush, I think it put them in a really awkward situation, as it would with any organization, but for the Bush in particular, given that they're, newer to the Call of Duty scene and the whole thing behind the Bush right now is the Jerry, Mook, and Sass are jokingly 0% owners, as they call themselves, and they're essentially using this season as like a proof of concept to try and prove uh, what it would look like if Barstool were to invest significantly into the Bush or a COD team. And this is an example of why Barstool wouldn't want to do that. And if they were, I listened to the Flank guys talking about this too. Uh, Carolina put Bush in a bad situation because obviously the Bush doesn't want to do fire dirty, and they like him, and they could have been like, yeah, um we'll waive your buyout fee, just go for free and go join Carolina. But then that sets a bad precedent if that like gets out or gets to any of the other CDL teams for any other potential Bush players who want to go to the league. Because it wouldn't happen with Optic, but just for lack of a better example, we'll just say like if Optic wanted to get Pro Loot again, and they're like, yeah, we're not going to pay the buyout because we know you didn't. We know if we say that, you'll just let Pro Loot go for free, and it saves us money. So obviously that wouldn't happen with them, but I just think this is a really shitty situation, but I'm totally not surprised that it would happen with Carolina, and I'll pass it to you because I think what I'm about to say is exactly what you want to say.
Yeah, Carolina should not be a CDL organization. After this season, I don't want the Carolina Royal Ravens to be one of the 12 teams, or if expansion, God forbid, did happen, I don't want them to be part of the 16 teams or the 20 teams. I don't want them to be part of the 100 teams that are in the CDL. The whole reason that the CDL exists on the surface is to limit access to the professional ranks and therefore be able to filter out the bad actors in the scene. The Dial Esports, the Red Reserves, all of that good stuff, right? Those are the orgs that come to mind when you think of like they're scamming, they're just bad for the players, bad for the scene, bad for the community. They don't really bring any positive value to the community or to the scene at all. And the Carolina Royal Ravens fit that to a T. They're just somehow allowed to exist within the CDL infrastructure, and that can't go on. If the CDL, if Microsoft, if Activision is serious about a professional esports league, I should make that clear. Like the professional part is very, very important, because if it's an amateur league, yeah, you're going to have scammers. You're going to have everybody come in, and whoever's going to say, hey, I can pay you $400,000. Like you're going to have those people come in, and then they're going to, basically run out of town as soon as the check bounces. So to be a professional esports league, you have to be serious about getting out these bad actors and getting out the scammers, and making sure that every organization that you are partnered with is reputable. They do have the money, they can pay, they're interested in paying the money toward building a competitive roster. Social media managers, we obviously heard this earlier this year that Brian Saint, who's the coach and GM of Carolina, was also acting as their social media manager, which is just bullshit. Like that's just ridiculous. And then you have this, and I don't blame Fire one bit. Neither one of us blames him even the slightest for doing this, because we talked about like this was a long time coming. He had been out of the CDL for years. This wasn't like Kenny potentially or Geo coming back in, where they were obviously very recently in the CDL and it's more of a continuation. No, this is like a really big return for Fire, just as the same as it was for Exceed coming into Carolina earlier in the year. This is a potentially life-changing move for him, so I understand, regardless of the price, that he was always going to try to make sure that that wasn't a factor in him not getting in this spot. But as a league, this is why you should have unionization as a group of players, to make sure that your players can't be taken advantage of like this. Your fellow players, the 50 some odd CDL players, they should not stand for Fire, who of course has not been in the CDL for a long time, but he was once in the CDL and he now is in the CDL again. You should not stand for him being taken advantage of this, because if it can happen to him, it can happen to a lot of you. It's not going to happen to Shotzi because Shotzi has all the leverage. It's not going to happen to Dashy or Simp because they have the leverage. But can it happen to Lurks? Maybe. Can it happen to Real? Maybe. Can it happen to, probably the bottom quarter of the league? Yeah, maybe. Maybe the teams, especially if they colluded, could they be like, yeah, we're not going to pay buyouts. Like, you guys can pay the buyout to your own challengers team, and then, we'll pay your contract, but we're not going to pay you pay you to pay the buyout or whatever. Like, and I know Crimsix has talked about this in the past. I think it was going from Dallas to New York, if I'm not mistaken. He had like a really big issue with, the buyout kind of affecting his salary, which again should not happen. Like, it should not be on the, and we talked about it before with players that go from starter to bench and then their salary decreases as well. Like, that doesn't make any sense in my mind. Like, if you bench a quarterback, you don't get to pay him less money off of that. Like, if you're going to pay him $20 million, you're going to pay him regardless of whether he plays or whether he sits on the bench for 4 quarters. And I think that's the same thing it should be for the CDL. So there are a lot of things here that I think definitely need fixed. But the very, very most important of it all is that Carolina needs to get the fuck out of the CDL. There's no other way to say that. Like, they are a stain on this league as long as they stay in it, because they're not paying their players nearly as well as they should. They're not paying the buyouts for their players like they should. They're not paying for their head coach and GM to be able to just focus on his head coach and GM responsibilities, which are two, like, they should probably have separate people doing those jobs like a lot of teams do, but he's doing both of them. Plus he's trying to be a social media manager, which is just frankly ridiculous. It reeks of the Paris Legion and how they basically skated by without paying any kind of money and making sure that their team was taken care of. So like, Carolina has to get out. They have to not be in the CDL anymore. And I hope that it does come to fruition. I know there were rumors in the past few years that maybe Space Station was coming in, but hopefully that actually comes to fruition this offseason. And I don't have to talk about them ever again past like June or July.
I think we can just lump it in because I thought it was kind of funny. It's the on the flank, they talked about Vancouver allegedly invoicing their players for a team dinner. I don't know why I said that weird. It sounded weird. And then Octane saying that it happened to him when he was on Seattle Surge. Obviously, it's different ownership now, but I still think it's kind of funny, and it's just another example. We've heard, maybe not like, I don't know. It's different specific circumstances, because I'm thinking of Cloud9 in my head right now from the salary stuff, looping in Carolina now with this buyout situation with Fire. Then you have the Vancouver stuff, which has mostly been like just weird circumstances with the whole Legend situation and Capsidal like coming in and getting the boot less than a couple months later. So different circumstances for all these orgs, but I do think that's just a nice way to put a bow on how you ended your segment of saying that whether there is expansion or not after this year, I think it is time that we have some reevaluation of the teams in the league, especially if it's going to stick to 12.
Yeah, and I thought it was weird too, because I know Octane said that it happened to him, but then Phoenix, who was their former head coach, he said, quote, "Got to be a new thing for budget cuts, because when I was with the Surge, me or my players never pay for dinner, that they took us out. Mind you, we ran up the bill with them far more than one time, so I'm actually shocked to be hearing this." So I don't know if there was like a change in attitude or change in philosophy in regards to this kind of thing within the Surge organization at some point. Like, maybe in the beginning they were like, this is kind of ridiculous that we have to pay for these guys, and then maybe they're like, once they had a competitive roster, I don't know if that changed how they viewed it. It was like, actually these guys could win, so like, let's make sure that we're treating them. And then now back when they're like not a very good team, which we'll I guess get to pretty shortly, like, then they're like, yeah, you guys still have to pay for dinner now. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but yeah, it's not good. Like, this is kind of ridiculous. Like, I understand that like NFL players, NBA players, like, that's not necessary because they make so much more money than really like anybody else in professional sports. Like, it, but these are esports players, like, and especially with the Surge, I don't think that they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on each of their players. So it does make sense, in my opinion, for the team to kind of cover their food, and like, especially if they're going out to team dinners, then, I think it makes a lot of sense in that regard. I did have one thing before we get off of the subject, because I wanted to talk about the Fire thing just one for like another minute. You said like the buyouts and stuff for the challengers, like, it's kind of imperative that the challengers teams have buyouts, like, to make sure that they're well compensated. And make sure that they're able to kind of make some money off of their players getting constantly poached. I don't know. Obviously, but Bush has probably lost like 5 or 6 players this season to the CDL at some point. And imagine if they just got 5 or 6 players taken from them and they didn't get anything in return, like no compensation or anything. Like that just hurts them in the long run. It hurts the challenger scene in the long run. And it does make it prohibitive, I want to say. Like that obviously is a downside to it, because it does seem like if Fire wasn't able to pay his buyout, then maybe Kenny or Gio might have been in that spot.
Well, I think that was the rumor, was that they were targeting players who didn't have buyouts, and that's why Kenny most likely got an opportunity, because he's seemingly a free agent. And the other thing with this whole thing, we have heard numerous times, whether it's in COD or in other esports, we've heard about 5-figure, 6-figure buyouts for players. This was allegedly $2,000. It is not like the Bush was asking for 20 grand or $100,000 for Fire. Like, this is literally, I mean, that's 2,000 in theory is what the Cloud9 current roster is getting paid per month in salary. So it's like 1 month of less than, so like saying that in terms of, we know Vancouver, at least based on that leaked document earlier in the year, is paying more than Cloud9 reportedly is paying for this current roster, which means that Fire's buyout is most likely less than 2 weeks worth of pay for a current player salary.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Like it's such a small, it's a drop in the bucket if you were supposed to be like a reputable organization. And you know, we've heard stuff about, I don't know about this current ownership for the Royal Ravens, but previously there were people when they were the London Royal Ravens that had made accusations that they hadn't been paid for months and that they were kind of working without their pay. So maybe that is lingered, or maybe, you know, the people that are running the organization are just like cheapskates and they don't know what they're doing and they shouldn't be in the scene. Like this is the whole reason that we have the CDL and just to kind of monetize it for Activision. But at the same point, like I think it's just really stupid. And the only other thing that I saw, and I don't know if you had seen this, was there was Anthony Geronio. He owns 1v1me. And he said that he was going to pay a portion of the buyout for Fire. He said that he's been a great part of the 1v1me community, and we're excited to see what's next for him. To support that move, we'll be covering a portion of his buyout. Good luck. Go do your thing. So that's cool for him. That should not be like a thing, though. Like that shouldn't be on anybody, like a third party, to kind of come in and assist him. Like then, because then you're going to have players that are like, please crowdfund, or like let me get like, you know, people in the community sending me $5 or $10 so I can pay my buyout, which that doesn't just from an optics point of view, like that's really bad for the league. To basically, like, if somebody in traditional sports looked on and said like, why are prospective players like trying to get like $2,000 in cash so they can go play in the pros, like that's a literally pay for play type deal, and that's not what the CDL should be. It should be everyone has the, you know, they're so talented and skilled, and this is the best of the best, and it isn't about like whether the organization can save, you know, nickels and dimes here and there to make sure that, you know, I don't know, like what are they going to do with $2,000? Like they're definitely in the red. So I mean, like the $2,000 or not $2,000, I think it's about the same when it comes down to it. Like if we just take like how much the Surge are reportedly in debt, which was like $6-7 million or whatever. If it's 6.02 versus like $6 million, it really doesn't matter. Like it's about the same. So you might as well add that $2,000 on it. But yeah, this is a really weird situation. I think there are, I don't know, like we haven't really heard too much about Boston and like how much it's affected them, and like how it seems like they're on the way out or trending on the way out, but we haven't heard too much about like the inner workings of that. Whereas we've heard from the Surge and Carolina, and I think Cloud9 is another one, which was not necessarily what I expected when they came in, but Those group of teams, like I think they should be seriously on the chopping block this coming off season.
The only thing I'll say on the Boston front is we had that report earlier this past I was gonna say off season, but mid season break, about Omit potentially entering a partnership, but then we never heard anything after that, and I don't think it was ever officially announced, or we haven't really heard anything like that. So I think that could be a signal of potentially what you were alluding to with Boston maybe being on the way out. But that's also, just to bring it up again, because we said it at the time when that was initially reported, that could be a way for some of these other teams to slowly like work their way out of their league, and other teams like work, like in theory it wouldn't happen now because of probably the bad blood between Bush and Carolina, but in theory Bush could partner with Carolina for the rest of this season and maybe even next season, and then by the following year Bush just fully takes over the spot, and it's like a slow transition of power sort of deal. Like that's at least how it would go in my mind. But like I said, we never heard about anything official from the OMID Boston report, so it's all trajectory. I don't even know what conjecture. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. We'll keep checking in on what's happening with all of these teams. I think we'll get some more information as we get closer to the offseason. That seems to be kind of the case with a lot of them because people start kind of scrambling for the door and trying to find the exit. And I think that's what we'll see here with at least one of these teams if I have the correct prediction. Let's talk about the matches, though. We have Major 3, Week 1. Again, we had a 2.5-week break after Major 2, and now we're back. Multiple rosters changed, including Carolina, who started off the action on Friday against the Paris Gentlemates. This is obviously Fire's return. It wasn't the greatest return I've ever seen. This was a tough first matchup, of course, for the Royal Ravens, and they lose this match 3-1 to Paris. Very dominant hardpoint win for Carolina to start this series, which might, have thought, people like, all right, like here we go. And then Paris buckled up and they were able to win the rest of the series. Overall thoughts on Paris winning 3-1 here?
Yeah, I mean, I would be lying if I said I wasn't at least a little concerned, at least after map 1, about Gentlemates. Like I saw the ghosty almost double negative KD Sib. I know we've talked a lot about Sib online versus Sib on land, but this looked like a slow start for him too. And I was just immediately jumping back in my head to what happened in the last of the qualifiers, and was immediately worried about potentially what this was going to look like for Gentlemates. But then, they flipped a switch and won the next 3 maps. It must have been Gentlemates' second match where I was thinking of,
and we can loop that one in.
Yeah, so I mean, I think because that's the more recent match, I was thinking about being somewhat impressed by Envoy and his showing in that second matchup against G2 for Gentlemates. But yeah, so Envoy had a 1.17 in the series against Gentlemates, so that's definitely the series against G2, so that's the one I was thinking of there. But yeah, overall for the Carolina Gentlemates match, I mean, it looked like, maybe just a slow start for Gentlemates on that initial map, but then they locked back in, and it's the expected result. You expected Gentlemates to beat this team if they're playing the way that we know they're capable of, and I think that the biggest example there is, Ghosty goes 12-23 map 1, Gentlemates lose, then he goes 35-16 map 4, and they win. So, not to put it all on Ghosty or anything like that, but it's obviously much easier to win when you got someone going double positive versus double negative. So, and then for the second match, I was starting to think that potentially there was the shot that what I had said earlier in the last episode about G2, like them. We picked G2 to win their first match and picked them to lose their second match. And I said, with G2's unpredictability, it was very possible they would lose their first match and then beat Gentlemates in the second match. And First hard point here against Gelmates was a 20-point game. Then Minnesota wins the Surge behind 13 kills from Kremp and 10 from Mamba. But then after that, it was pretty much all Gentlemates in the last two maps, even though the overload was close 6-5. In all three respawns for G2 against Gentlemates, I believe all of the Minnesota players went negative. So obviously pretty tough for G2 to win a match there against anybody, let alone a team that won an event already this year when everyone on the squad is going negative in respawns.
Paris didn't look invulnerable in any game mode. Of course, they went 2-0 in overload, but they do lose that hard point to start the series in the first one, and then they lose the S&D. I think, just the fact that they're winning matches is a good sign, because that was not a guarantee in the Major 2 qualifiers. So I don't know what this necessarily means. Of course, we were a little more skeptical about their place in our power rankings last week, because they just look so bad during the Major 2 qualifiers that's hard to forget, especially how long those went on. And then they did look like they bounced back a little bit at the Major, but they weren't as nearly as good as they were at Major 1. So I guess there's just going to have to be more time that we see them and see if they're actually back and return to form. We should also talk real quick. I don't know if there's a specific point or match that you want to point to, but obviously the meta changed. The NPC comes in, the new maps come in as well. So in this first series of the weekend, we had Gridlock Hardpoint to start, obviously, a return from the Black Ops 4 game, and then there was Sake Hardpoint as well, making its debut. That was the second Hardpoint of this series. Just overall thoughts on the meta that you saw this weekend and the maps that you saw played this weekend as well.
Yeah, I really thought that most of the new maps were, a good breath of fresh air. I thought I was looking and I didn't write it down in the notes, but I think I can do Control F real quick in the notes. So I believe it was 5 Gridlock Hardpoints played, 6 Fringes. Plaza was only 2, I believe. And then Saki was 6 too. So it was 6 for Saki, 5 Gridlock, 6 Fringe, and 2 Plaza. So Plaza was the least played new map, obviously outside of Clifftown, which we seemingly won't see at all.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that it was in I think it was the Carolina-Vancouver match, which we'll talk about later. Yeah, it was map 5 in that match, and it was a pretty fast map, and I think that's part of what I remember from playing Plaza S&D back in the day was, even in pubs when it was like 6v6, if you get everybody just running into that club to hear that, that club music and rush the bomb site in there, like it can turn into a bloodbath pretty quickly. And we saw one round at least that I remember vividly where it was straight up 8-man hit 4v4 in that small little bomb site room, and it was like a 15-second round. So I think that was obviously Plaza was the only map that wasn't played a ton, so didn't get a good read for that. Outside of that was my initial takeaway from that was a lot of fast pace rounds, and saw that hit a couple times where teams were just sending it at that bomb site. And I think, as people get more reps on that map, you can maybe adapt it a little bit. Some teams will inevitably, if they figure out playing it, they'll find a way to just fully give up that bomb site on defense and find their strat for countering it from multiple angles and that sort of thing. So will be interesting to see how that progresses now throughout the rest of the year. But I think looping that into the other maps, I just really felt like, and this falls to part of the Envoy conversation too, is I felt like the NPC was... It had a very noticeable impact for me in terms of just like it felt like it's tough for me to say because I still think the Dravik was a better gun overall, but I think the NPC is a better SMG, And that might sound weird to say, but I think that's just, I go back to that one example I was saying where somebody in one of the scrims we were watching during this recent meta change over the break and stuff was like they couldn't believe they didn't get a longer range kill with the NPC versus the Dravik, and um, I just think the Dravik was better at long range, but that's, you don't need an SMG to also be able to map people across the map. It should be a gun that kills pretty close range, and the NPC did a really good job of killing people very close range. And there were a couple times this weekend where people were like getting 3 pieces without even having to reload the NPC, and I was like, okay, this gun's good. Like it's not like that we lost the Dravik and got a shitty SMG thrown in there. Like the NPC is really good, and I think even Neptune said in one of his post game interviews that like it's a god gun. So I think that was kind of my overall takeaway from the meta perspective of this weekend, was that the NPC did have a noticeable impact, and I felt like there were multiple matchups where like SMG players that we've talked about or questioned throughout this year were having slightly better performances potentially with the NPC. Even someone like Hydra, I felt like it just like looked more natural in his hands, and I think it might have been. Did we only have one LAT match this week? I think we might have. I can't remember.
Yeah.
I think it was, yeah. Um, I think it literally was map 1, Saki Hardpoint for LAT versus Miami. Hydra goes 27-17, and it wasn't even like yeah, he was frying with it, but it felt like even his movement, I can't think of a great way to describe it, but just it felt like more natural when I was just watching him on my screen with the NPC in his hand. Like it just looked right, and some of the kills he was picking up, I was like, that's Hydra. And maybe that's like a difference between the Dravik and the NPC. They both, in my opinion, they're both really good guns. They just did different things, and it's possible the NPC is better in some areas than the Dravik was, which could be interesting to see if that leads to any like G8 attachments or anything down the road. But at least for now, the initial perspective from, even like I said, I'm pretty sure Neptune called it a god gun in his post-match interview. So it will be interesting to see if how long this sticks around, if the players are already thinking that the gun is just super broken.
I do think they think that there were a lot of comments, I would say, before the matches or even during the matches. I saw that I think it was Formal was like Abe's looking like former like old Abe or whatever, and then Dashy's like I was looking like old Abe with this gun too, and he was just kind of making fun of like how good it is and kind of maybe shoring up this.
Bees?
Yeah.
I was thinking of Abe from.
But like, I mean, you would think that like a BZ and like players like Hydra and all of them would feel more natural on like a faster, like more, I would say melty SMG gun rather than what the Dravik was kind of like not like necessarily a flex weapon like in that sense. It wasn't like the Maddox or whatever, but it certainly is closer to being able to flex with it than the NPC is, which obviously it should change the meta. If this gun is very good on smaller maps, then you might see more SMGs or just the flex playing on the SMG a lot more on those smaller maps, or changing their play style with the gun, which is always interesting. And that's why it's always nice to get the changes in the meta, because especially now we're going to see, or we did see this first week of qualifiers, and then we get to see the minor, and we get to see the rest of the qualifiers. I think how the play style evolves over the next like 4 to 5 weeks, that's going to be very, very intriguing going into the next major. And it might change how we view a lot of these teams as they're getting used to it. Almost kind of like what was happening early in the Major 1 qualifiers, where we saw a lot of teams that were pretty good out of the gate before the break. And then when teams had like 5, 6, 7 weeks to practice, then they felt like a lot more comfortable. And we saw how different the standings would change when everybody had more practice. So maybe we'll see that here in the Major 3 qualifiers. We're going to move on, though, to the second match. I did want to say real quick that Sake Hardpoint appeared, I think, in the 6 of the first 7 series of this week. It kind of tailed off toward the end, but I was pretty surprised about how prevalent this map is in the rotation. Granted, we have one fewer map than we were supposed to, so maybe that played a factor. But in that second series is LAT versus Miami. We both picked LAT. LAT wins. Pretty interesting series. It was a very lopsided hard point win for LAT. Then a round 11 S&D win on Fringe, which was the first time that Fringe had appeared this weekend as well. Miami comes back on overload. They win that. They force a game 4, and then LAT wins 250-197. What did you think? We've been talking about Miami a lot. What did you think of Metals? What did you think of Trakes? The two people that I think have been kind of earmarked as potential people to replace with Real.
Well, that's my takeaway. I was going to say, I think you could make the argument that LAT could have won all 4 maps in this series because they were up 3-1 in the overload, and Miami just ran off 4 straight caps to pull off a pretty good comeback in that map 3. But immediately, like you said, I already talked a little bit about Hydra, and you talked about Abizi, NPC. Both of them looked good throughout this series. From Miami perspective, though, Metals goes 15-23 map 1, and that was immediately what I started thinking of, and I put it down in the notes when I was typing his stats out. I was like, I got to keep an eye on what he does, because if Miami gets 3-0 choke slammed here and Metals goes super negative, like that's immediately going to be the conversation is, yeah, Metals got to go, got to bring Riala and all that. But after that, Metals went 9-9 in the search. He went 29-27 in the map for hardpoint, and really it was Rencor was the player who struggled the most for Miami in the series, going 75-90. And Rencor, we've talked enough about Rencor and Super over the last pretty much year at this point. They're like the face of the franchise, for lack of a better term. They are the building blocks. So obviously, one bad series here from Rencor isn't going to be like Miami fans are throwing up the pitchforks to get Real in and Rencor out. But I think that's like going to be the narrative around Miami now that we know Real is like lurking. Is how does that impact what fans are saying about what they want from the team, as well as how is it affecting the players? Because it's possible that even for someone like Rencor, that's like, doesn't even seemingly have to worry about his spot. Is he like mentally checked out because he thinks this team is already done? Like, I'm not blaming him or saying that's the mindset, but I wouldn't mind anybody, or I could totally see anybody having that mindset if that's the situation they're in with any team. So that's what I'll be monitoring going forward here with Miami, as long as they, now that we know Real is signed to Miami, but seemingly there is some visa situation stuff that's like preventing him from being able to be thrown into the lineup right now. So it's like this, it's like a dark cloud lurking, like it's there, but you can't really do anything about it, and then you don't know when the rain's gonna start pouring. Not my best analogy, but I think it's decent.
We've talked about it before, and I think the comparison is when you have a quarterback and then you draft a rookie, and the pressure that puts on that first quarterback, and basically the clock that it puts them on is like, it's not about if you're going to be replaced, it's about when, and like how soon are you going to mess up that we're going to replace you. And I think that's just the case that Miami is in. Like the players, I don't think that Rincor or Super are really at risk of getting replaced. I think that would be pretty silly, but Metals and Trakes are definitely at risk. Like one of them is certainly going to be replaced. I made my prediction that by the beginning of the Major 4 qualifiers, as long as Real's visa issues are resolved and all that, he will be in this roster in some shape or form. I don't know for who necessarily, but it just makes sense. Like, you don't sign a guy to a 3-year contract if you don't believe that he is the future or a part of your future of this organization. So yeah, it obviously was not a great result. Granted, Miami has struggled against those top teams all season. They have not really been able to break through the glass ceiling and join the top 4 or top 5 teams, despite their Major 2 qualifiers. But Yeah, they just didn't look very good. Like you said, LAT could have won this 4-0 if that was possible, and that's not a good sign for Miami. But maybe another week, different matchups and everything can make them feel a little bit better and get them some momentum, which they desperately need at this point in the season to kind of carry them through the rest of these qualifiers. Next up on Friday, we had G2 versus Vancouver. We just have to loop in Vancouver. Obviously, we talked already about G2 a little bit, but the Surge, of course, they have this new roster. Nero is officially announced. Just to hell with the Vancouver Surge because they were the only team that really hadn't announced anything. Their roster changed before we got to the matches on Thursday or on Thursday or on Friday, excuse me. And Nero looked pretty good. Vancouver looked pretty good. I don't know how to feel about this. They 3-0 G2. We'll talk about G2, I'm sure, but so they 3-0 G2 on Friday, and then they come back at the end of Saturday and they beat Carolina. So Nero gets his revenge. You called it, and you predicted that win in part because of a Nero revenge match, which was kind of a crazy match. It really could have went either way. The hard points were very competitive. Really, all the respawns were really competitive, and it came down to the S&Ds, which Vancouver won. So 2-0 Vancouver, that hasn't happened this season. They've had like 5 or 6 wins all season long. Now they get 2 more. How do you feel about the Surge at this point? It's small sample size, but 2-0, one against like a middle tier team, one against Carolina, who's like low to middle tier, I would say, trying to kind of get into that middle tier solidly. Do you think this is a sign of things to come? Are you confident that Vancouver can kind of keep the ball rolling here?
As long as Breaking Point is updated, if they aren't, I'm sorry, but even with these 2 wins, they have 85 points right now, and the Falcons are in 8th with 140. So the Surge basically have to have very, very strong performances over the next couple months in order to turn around their season and avoid missing champs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'll say that I think they've obviously put themselves in a good position with this 2-0 start to at least start in the winners bracket at Major 3, which, you know, given the circumstances, like you can't be mad about that, and that is what it is. But I'm not gonna get overly excited about this Vancouver team just from these games. I think if anything, uh, this is kind of like like I said when we were mentioning G2 earlier with the Gentlemates match, you can't trust G2, and it feels
No.
like this is an example of, we were talking earlier in the year, I think it was Aches who was like saying like the G2 placement at Major 1 could end up being one of the things that holds the team back because
Mm-hmm.
if they bombed out at Major 1, they maybe would have looked for an upgrade at the roster. At that time, obviously, Aches was alluding to Skies, but at this point, you can basically say like anything. And G2 is one of the teams that just hasn't made a roster change this year, and now it's losing to a team that did just make a roster change. And we talked about it. Um, who was the first team to make a roster change this year? I already forget. Oh, it's Vancouver actually, because of the legend
Oh, yeah.
situation. Um, so I don't remember if it was with them, but I've said it before, so the point still stands is that in some cases the team that shows a sense of urgency and is more proactive in trying to make these
Mm-hmm.
moves, it can pay dividends for. And on the flip side of that, a team like G2 in this situation where they seemingly haven't been proactive or willing to make a change, it's potentially leading to them stagnating, and now they're dropping a match here against a team that on paper should have been pretty beatable for them. Um, I will say, I think that the switch for Gwyn to an SMG in conjunction with the MPC being a really good SMG is possibly a perfect storm for Vancouver, and maybe this is what unlocks Rookie of the Year level Gwyn again. So that'll be something worth keeping an eye on. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought TJ played pretty well this weekend too. So I'm not gonna discredit what Vancouver did, but I'm not ready to just I'm not ready to say Surge is winning champs.
Yeah, I think that's the correct way to view this, is that they played two pretty flawed teams that I think to this point, Minnesota had been pretty consistent in beating the lower tier teams, but they had struggled to really break into the upper echelon. They lost a lot of matches to everybody except FaZe that were in that top four. But they had been able to beat like the bottom four, which is important. Like really to make champs, like that's really what you have to do a lot of times. And I just don't know if that's the case anymore. Like we're gonna have to continue to watch. They, of course, played Paris. I expected them to lose to Paris like most of the time. They should not be losing to Vancouver unless Vancouver is now kind of like on the ascension and they're kind of on the rise and all that. But I don't think that's the case. I think that they're still gonna be like in that eighth, like top eight or not right, bottom four, and then maybe are able to get out of that bottom four. Like you said, they're quite a bit behind the Falcons, but we'll get to them. And I think it's realistic that they could make it to champs if they can translate some of this online stuff to LAN where it's going to matter more, because one win on LAN goes more, goes along further than a win online. So yeah, Vancouver's it's impressive that they won, but I don't know if it actually is indicative of any future success. G2, I mean, I said it from the beginning, like Skies was not my preferred AR for this team. I felt like, they should have went a different way. I didn't know exactly who they could get, but it does seem like the end is drawing near for this team, this iteration of the team. But like you said, it's not a guarantee that Skies is the guy to get the boot anymore. Like it isn't like a open and shut case whether Skies is the problem with this team. I think they have more problems than just him. It just seems like if you're going to make a one person change, it does still seem like he might be the person to just move if you can get an AR, which is, we've talked about it so much that it's not an easy task and there's no guarantee that will actually happen. But yeah, Vancouver, they win against G2. They beat Carolina. That's not really groundbreaking either. Carolina is, it is what it is. Fire did not play particularly well in that series, especially in the S&D, dropped a breadstick. And it's Vancouver. Maybe they are winning champs, and maybe you'll have to eat your words later on this season. Let's talk about the Saturday matches, starting with FaZe versus Boston. I don't really know if you have too much to say about this. Of course, this was the return of Afro. He comes back in. He replaces Snoopy. So this is the first time in a long time that Snoopy had not been in a Boston Breach match. And this was pretty dominant. The overload was an overtime match, but 250-98, 100-point club win for FaZe. 6-3 S&D, and then FaZe wins in overtime. This was the first look that we did. I think it did get a look at overtime, the new overtime rules. How did you feel about this and just the overall series?
I did, in terms of the overtime, I did think it was I don't think interesting is the right word for it, but like I was just I wasn't sure how it was going to reflect on the scoreboard after it, because obviously earlier this year when it's been like tied 2-2 and then it goes into OT, it shows up as 3-2 in the post-match scoreboard. In this case, it didn't show any score after the game on the broadcast. It just said what the winning time was in overtime, and I thought that was interesting because that kind of reminds me of what the scoreboard looked like in like Black Ops 2. I think of that infamous nifty cap on standoff against Envy at whatever UMG event that was, and it like shows the time on the screen. It was literally like 1 second faster than Envy's, and that's what that kind of reminded me of. But yeah, I mean, not much to really talk about from this series. I think the overall talking point, honestly, from a FaZe perspective and in this match, I thought 0-4 just like absolutely dominated, and again going full circle with what we've already said on this show, like maybe 0-4 with the NPC, that allows him to hit new levels. Already talked about him like finding that MVP form during Major 2 and seemingly turning around his season from a point where during the major two qualifiers, people were literally talking about 04 needs to be dropped or replaced. And then he wins a tournament, wins MVP of said tournament, and now he's playing in a meta that maybe suits him even better. Could be, something to keep an eye on for FaZe. But um, for Boston, I honestly couldn't believe it when it was happening. But there's a clip from the flank where they were going through Purge's KDs for every match this series. And obviously, we always stress on the Ego Chall podcast that KD isn't everything. But when you say KD isn't everything, that means that it still means something at the end of the day. It's not that you can't totally ignore it, it's just that you shouldn't totally only care about KD. But when the Flank Boys were analyzing Purge's performances this year, they found something that kind of blew my mind. And I guess given the way Boston has played as a team this year, it might not be the most shocking revelation. Um, but they noticed that Purge has had a positive KD twice this entire season. One was like a 1.4 KD against C9, and they immediately discredited that because it's the Cloud9 team with the recent roster that's been getting slammed in respawns but has been winning S&Ds. So like you expect people to have good KDs when they're winning convincingly in the respawns. And the only other one, I believe it was against G2, and it was like a 1.02 KD. So even if you count the Cloud9 series, Purge has, based on what they were showing on the flank, Purge has gone positive twice in a series this entire year. And that's just like, that just blows my mind. That's like, I get KD isn't everything, but it has to mean something. And if those are the numbers, like, I don't know. That doesn't bode well for him. That's for sure.
It doesn't bode well for Boston either. They have been much worse this season than they were the last 2 years that he was on the team. And they literally were benching him and it seemed like he was gone and then he's back. And, I have no ill will. Neither one of us do. But at the same time, we said it, like, Afro doesn't really move the needle with this team, especially if it's not paired with another player coming into this roster. And it just further makes me think that Boston is really wasting the potential of this nasty Spark duo that they've kind of stumbled upon. It didn't seem like they had a great big plan or anything. And I think those are two players that they can actually build around and maybe even make champs, honestly, if they were able to get the right two players in with them. It's just obvious that Purge isn't that guy. And it's time for him to go down to challengers. And if he performs well enough, there's a chance that he gets back into the CDL. Like if he finds the right system, like he did with Boston for a time, then he can kind of come back and have that success. But yeah, it's not looking good, and I think that the stats kind of prove that, and that's just really unfortunate for Boston that they didn't make a change before these qualifiers to kind of move him out and bring someone in. And we'll see. I guess as we move on, what happens, like we should just loop in their second match because it was another loss for them, but they played Toronto earlier today. They do win the S&D in that series, but they had to come back from a 4-1 deficit. They lose the respawn maps decently close. Like it wasn't like it's not a blowout or anything, but at the same time, like this was a pretty clear series where it's like Nasty is much better than these guys. And it makes me regret, him not getting on a Toronto or getting on wherever, honestly, to be honest. Minnesota would be fun, I think, if he was able to go there. But yeah, did you have any thoughts on the Toronto-Boston match? And Purge did look better here, I should say. Like he didn't play nearly as bad as he did in that first series, but they still lost 3-1.
Yeah, I think, weird way of looping in Toronto's other match here too, but I think in terms of Toronto, they showed in both of their series this weekend and in this match that we're talking about with Boston, it was Kleenex with the MPC. He was doing his thing. Kips obviously played very well map one. So did Joe, but Kleenex in the last two maps, uh, pretty pretty convincingly did what the tissue being an issue things there. And in their previous match earlier in the weekend against Falcons, it was really Kips and Joe who were being that dynamic duo that they have seemingly been since uh, Kips entered the roster. Really, so um, I think for Boston, yeah, I mean. They showed good resilience by pulling off that 1-4 comeback in the S&D. But outside of that, like you kind of said, it was basically just like Nasty is trying to do his thing, and I just at this point, especially we've said it now, like literally the three teammates that he was getting second with multiple times last season have all won at least one tournament this year so far, and now he's just like fighting for a shot to even get the champs when he was literally in the grand finals of champs last year, and it sucks for him.
Yeah, and let's just talk about Toronto. They were actually the next match, Toronto versus Falcons that you were talking about, and then Toronto also played Boston on Sunday. Insight wasn't like the guy he was in England, but he was good enough, and I think we saw with Joe, like Joe is still Joe, and Kleenex is still Kleenex. Like those guys are. That's why it's been so disappointing, at least for part of the season, where it felt like there's a lot of talent on this team and they're just not able to put it together. They're losing a lot of matches that they really shouldn't be losing. And then they go 2-0 to start the major three qualifiers. What kind of confidence level do you have with Koi right now, coming off of a very impressive major two and then these first two wins to start the major three qualifiers?
I think you put it in a good way there. Like we saw, Kips has been. I've been really impressed with Kips since he debuted with this
Rookie of the
Toronto
year
team.
leader, maybe?
I mean, I think at this point, like he's got a good shot, and it's gonna come down to whether we actually give someone an opportunity to win the award when they didn't play the full year in the CDL.
Could also be that Trakes
Um,
gets kneecapped at some point and gets taken out of the
yeah.
running by his own team.
Um, but I've been impressed with Kips. Joe, I have been on the Joe hype train for a while now, and he played like an absolute all star in this matchup. And I think I mean, it's even scarier if the MPC in his hand like takes him to another level like that. That's a pretty scary thought for the other teams in the league. But you said it too with Insight, and it's like I think there was a flank clip. I didn't put it in here, but they were kind of uh, talking about Insight and his seemingly lack of impact at this point in this match in particular on Saturday. And I mean, it was talked about at least at one point in recent weeks, like in terms of replacing Toronto. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen now because they're winning and they're coming off a good showing at the last event. But I mean, just to loop it in with that Boston match, we
Yep.
talked about it in the offseason, like Nasty on this Toronto team, that would be something I would get really excited about for Toronto, and just I think that would be. I mean, we've already seen what Joe and Nasty can do together. Like it obviously took a little bit of time when they were on LAT, but then at the end of that season in MW3, I believe it was MW3, those years are becoming a blur in my head now, but towards the end of whatever season that was when they were on LAT with like it was Joe, Nasty, Kremp, and Ghosty. Um, they slowly built themselves up to being a strong team at the two biggest events at the end of the season. And I don't think it's going to happen at this point in the season, but I mean, I would be all for Nasty going in for Insight. It would obviously suck for Insight, just given the way the team is playing right now, regardless of his individual performance and what they just accomplished at the last event. Coming from that, one and done playing bracket to making it to a championship Sunday, like to get dropped after that would suck for him. Um, but I think that kind of goes back to the conversation we were having with G2. It's like, how, you can stick with this team and potentially stagnate, or you can be a little bit proactive and try to get ahead of any potential slump and make the move to pack a punch. But I don't think that's in the cards for Toronto. I mean, they've been, for lack of a better term, they've been pretty loyal with Insight, despite all of the, allowing them to explore their options every offseason and whatnot. They've come back every year despite that. So I don't think it's in the cards, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Have we ever seen a team do that where they were doing well and winning matches and then decided, hey, like, we don't think the potential of this team is all that it's cracked up to be, and I think we could get better? Like, people have done that after the offseason. Like, that LAT team you mentioned, of course, there was a lot of potential for that team if they brought them all back the following season, but they were like, well, we can get Scrap and Hydra and we can build a super team. So to me, that made a lot of sense. Although I was thinking, like, if that LAT team was still around, like that exact roster, how good they would be this season, like all together, like Ghosty, Nasty, or Ghosty, Crimp, Joe Deceives, all of them, like on one team would be really, really gross. But obviously that's not the case. Toronto, though, I think what you said about Minnesota, or what Ake said about Minnesota, really applies to Toronto. Like, I think that placing at Major 2 and these wins that have come, especially since they brought in Kips, I think it might do a lot of damage to this team long term, because they are probably a championship team if they have the right AAR player. Like I said at the beginning of the season, if they had Ghosty, they would be like in my top 3, like without a second thought. And I still think that. But right now, obviously, they probably feel like they're like a top 3, top 4 team because they just, went to Major 2. They had a great placing. I don't think that they're that kind of team. My power rankings didn't really reflect that they're that kind of team. Even though they beat LAT and Paris at the major, I was like, I will still take Paris and LAT over them. And I feel that way even after these matches. So yeah, I think that they're long term. I think there's a pretty clear ceiling with this team, and that's going to be kind of heartbreaking for them if they finish like 4th at champs, when I think they probably could actually win champs if they upgraded at the AR position.
I will just say, while I totally agree from a G2 perspective on, potentially having earlier placings ruin what could be, a chance to improve the roster overall, from a Toronto perspective, and I don't think this is the case for other teams because of the chemistry and the long-standing relationship that Toronto has with like Insight and Kleenex, and now Insight and Kleenex playing with Joe. We saw last year, and literally with Mercules, the system that Toronto has with the coaching staff, and over the years, the like one player has been changed here and there. But really, like, most recently, the consistent duo of Kleenex and Insight. Then you add in Joe Deceives recently. Then you're just able to plug in a substitute like Mercules last minute and have it work in that system. And obviously, that can be a testament to Mercules as an individual. However you want to look at it, I still think in part it has to be, right individual player being thrown in last minute to the right situation with a team that knows how to, play and operate as a unit. So what I'm trying to say is we have seen now multiple times, even last year with Beans, now this year with Kips, like we have seen different iterations of an Insight team with Toronto finding success, and it doesn't always have to be the flashiest way. There were times where Toronto was really good at S&D, and that was their way. They were winning some matches that people might not have predicted them to win. But at the end of the day, I do think that, while I don't think Toronto is going to make a change right now, I think it is possible that the sun is setting on Insight's time with Toronto. I just don't think it's going to happen right now, but I do think he has shown that whatever system Toronto is trying to operate under and they have had success with over the years, he is a part of that, and we don't know what it looks like if you take him out of that equation.
Yeah, that's very true. I think it comes down to, in the end, for me, do you value the consistency and the organization and the kind of system that you were mentioning, that it does seem to be very well orchestrated and well run? Do you value that, or do you value championships and like the chaotic nature of your journey to a championship? We just saw with Optic last year, Optic year before. It is not like a steady incline. It's not like, two steps, two steps, two steps. Sometimes it's you take 4 steps up and then you take 18 steps down, and then you go back up, and then you're able to win a championship, and you have to make roster changes, and you have to go through like the trials and tribulations. And does Toronto want that? Does Toronto, or is Toronto able to kind of take on that kind of stress and chaos that roster changes and changing the system, what it comes with it? And I don't know if they are. Obviously, to this point, they've stuck by their 2 guys, and I really appreciate that. I think more teams do need more stability. I think, and this is a bad example because of how it's ended, but the Boston Breach, I think in part with how they did at Champs last year and how they were able to pull off wins that they necessarily should not have been able to pull off. It came down to the fact that they were together for so long. They had the same team, and they got to build that chemistry week and month and year after year. Whereas a lot of teams kind of make these roster changes and they're together for a few months, and then it's kind of like a new team, and they kind of have to start over. And Toronto, to your point, has been very steady in that they're not making wholesale changes. They're not completely overhauling their roster every offseason. At the same point, though, they have been a bridesmaid, but never the bride. They have not been able to reach the mountaintop that Optic and FaZe and some of these other teams have been able to. And those teams have went through, I think, other than FaZe, I don't think FaZe has went through a lot of trials and tribulations, to be quite honest. They've had a pretty smooth road. Like, they've lost, a lot in the finals or in Championship Sunday, but they've never been like losing like all of the matches like Optic did last year. That's not really what they've been able to do. But Toronto has been, I think, like a step down, but certainly in the conversation for one of the most consistent teams in the CDL's history. And yet, like, it hasn't netted them a championship. And I think this is like this is an open year. Like, Optic, I think, is still the favorite if you look long-term, just based on their roster. I think they can certainly win a championship. FaZe feels like it. I'm less sold on LAT. I think Paris can do it, but like, there's no guarantee this year. And Toronto, this is a good spot for them, in my opinion, to go and get it, to go get Nasty, go get whoever. Like, Nasty's obviously the one that I think will make the most sense and probably the most attainable for them. But wouldn't you feel a lot better about this team if Nasty was on it? Like, wouldn't you think like this is the ceiling just lifts so much higher? And it does feel like a championship is within their reach with Nasty. I don't think a championship is within their reach with Insight. And, that's not to say they can't go to a grand finals or they can't compete and beat like Optic or FaZe or LAT at a major, because they just did beat a bunch of really good teams at the major. But I don't know if they're actually a championship team until they resolve that point. I don't think that they can call themselves a true contender until they make that change. And I don't know if they're really ready to make that change. Next up, let's talk about Falcons versus FaZe. I think the Falcons just kind of suck. Unfortunately, like it is what it is. Like, they didn't make their change. We thought they were going to bring in QK. We thought they were going to do the role swap. They did do the role swap, but like still at this, I mean, it's also a role swap and it's a meta change at the same time. So we don't really get to see how things would have worked out the exact same way that they might have like a month ago. But the Falcons, they go 0-2 this week. They lose to Toronto 3-1, obviously, in that first series. And then they lose to FaZe today 3-1. Panic. I want to get your panic meter. Where is it with the Riyadh Falcons in the aftermath of like this kind of botched roster change, role swap kind of ideas they were floating during the break?
I already had very low expectations for them. At least after this whole uh, roster debacle, I was hopeful that um, if Kismet was able to get onto an SMG and pair it alongside Pred, um, that could potentially help unlock that SMG duo and lead to better things for Falcons. I watched the games this weekend, and I don't know if my brain is just fried or what, but I couldn't even tell you if I got a good read on who really is the flex now. And I think part of that, they were playing Scar um, hard point on the last match today, and that's where Kismet drops 44. But I know like he was using an M15 at moments, because I remember him. He got like a two piece at the end of the map, and that's really where it like clicked for me. It was like, oh shit, I wasn't really paying attention to what gun Kismet's using, and then in turn I wasn't really um paying attention to what Xmit and Pred were doing on the map. So I think that Scar is a map that Scar is one of the maps we've seen 8 M15s on at points earlier this season. So it's not surprising that Kismet was using that. If I went back and watched the VOD, I wouldn't be surprised to see him flip flopping between the NPC and the M15 on that map. But um, bad job by me, and honestly, to not really pay super close attention to that. I'll definitely have to be more mindful of that here coming up for the Falcons. But I think regardless of what they're doing from a role standpoint, like obviously this is just a tough spot to be in for this team. Now granted, they did play FaZe, who won the last event. And regardless of what you think about Toronto and Insight, as we're just outlining, like they placed pretty well at the last event too. So it's not like Falcons is losing to quote unquote bottom teams here. They're quoting to two teams that were at the last championship Sunday of the last event. I just think we're gonna have to see what's next for Falcons. And I'm trying to scroll ahead here. They have their next match outside of the minor. They play Vancouver, Miami, and C9 as their remaining matches for the major three qualifiers. I mean, those are three matches on paper that are winnable for Falcons, but if they are not playing like they're capable of, they're also matches they could lose. And I think that'll be a little more telling and give us a better idea of what we can expect for Falcons for the rest of this season. But at least from this FaZe series, I mean, given everything that's going on with Falcons, the last thing I was expecting them here was a 3-1 by FaZe where Falcons win the S&D. And, even if you want to look at the scores even better, like it was a pretty wild ending to the overload where Falcons captured the device with like 20-ish seconds left to make it 4-4, and then FaZe was able to rally it to punch the game-winning cap in like right before overtime. The last map is a 9-point win for FaZe in the hard point. So outside of obviously the S&D wasn't particularly close and map 1 wasn't really close, but um I mean those maps are pretty close despite the what the stats might tell you, because map 1 everyone on Falcons was negative. Map 3, it's a 5-4 win for FaZe, like I just outlined in the overload, but everyone on FaZe was positive and everyone on Falcons was negative. And then even though it's a 9-point win for FaZe in the map 4 hard point, Kismet goes 44 and 31, but the rest of the guys are negative on Falcons. So I don't know. I think possibly this is a rough combination of strength of schedule coming into play for a team that's like, I don't know if doubt is the right word, but it's like, if you're going through this period of trials, trying new things and potentially trying new players and stuff like that, like doubt has to be in the minds of everyone on this team, really, in terms of what they are expecting, not only as a team but from themselves, right? Like even someone like Celium who got the Giga bag, like he has to be second guessing himself right now, even if it's only a little bit, because it's like damn, did I mess up this offseason? And then like 2 seconds later, he's like, no, I got like over $1 million. I'm good. Um, Even if it's like just for a brief flicker like that, like it has to, Kismet's got to be thinking about, oh man, what would have went different this season if I was on SMG the whole time. Pred's probably thinking like what could be different if I was with Kismet on SMG the whole time. Xnid's got to be like, I've been playing pretty well in these online matches, but it hasn't translated to LAN quite yet for me. Like there's all these little things they could be thinking of in the back of their minds, and it only gets compounded by these, the reports of potential changes, and then the changes not going through, and then the lack of success after that happens. Like, it's just got to be a rough stretch for the Falcons guys. So I feel for them in that sense, and hopefully we'll see what they're able to do, especially as I outline those the next 3 qualifier matches for them should be very telling of what we can possibly expect from Falcons for the rest of the year.
I wonder if these next few matches, like, really, I think the pressure keeps mounting for them. Like, even if it is mostly just like them putting pressure on themselves, like you were talking about, but we just talked about, like, there were 2 players in this roster that were officially put on notice, essentially, that they could be replaced or that they were going to be replaced. They were trialing without one of them at different points in time. And that's crazy to think about, that they didn't make a roster change, that they're both still here, and how that can affect the team as a whole. Like, you're making changes within, you're maybe making external changes, like bringing someone in, then you decide not to. It's a really murky situation, and we talked about it. Like, Clayster has a really tough job here, because I do think at the very best of this roster, they can be a top 4 team and they can get to Championship Sunday at these majors, but we have not seen anything close to that. They've been able to beat top teams at different points. Like, I think they beat Paris, they beat Optic, of course, in the major 2 qualifiers. I think they might have beaten FaZe or whatever. All those wins don't really mean anything if you can't follow it up and be consistent and be a true threat to those top teams when it comes to LAN. And I mean, it's kind of a rough go here. I don't know. Like, if they don't win at least 2 of those upcoming 3 matches, like, something's gotta break. Like, there's no way that you can continue on with that. If you're losing to Vancouver, I forget, Miami and Carolina, I think you said, like, if they're not winning 2 of those matches, like, there's no way that they can continue on and try to be competitive with the top teams. Even if Vancouver is much better or Miami starts to figure things out or whatever, like, it doesn't matter. Like, you can't lose 2 of those matches and expect to be a true threat to anybody at the very top. And I think that's when you pay Selim reportedly over $1 million. I'm sure you're paying Pred a lot of money as well, and you're paying Kismet and all that. Like, this team is paid to be a championship level team, and they haven't come close to it. At a certain point, time runs out, and you have to kind of flip the page and go with something else. And I just don't know what that's going to be. I don't think they know what that's going to be. And I think, to your point, that adds more pressure and changes kind of the dynamic of this team the more time goes on and the more matches that they play and the more matches, unfortunately, that they lose. Last match that we haven't talked about is the last match of the weekend, Optic versus Cloud9. C9 wins S&D, so that's kind of been a trend that they've continued. It was around 11. They won on Fringe. It was interesting. Like, I don't really, like, they really just, like, I think just switched up the tempo and they went B, and they just picked Optic one by one, basically picked them off, and then they won round 11. But the respawns, Optic was, pretty decisive. They won 250, 186, 250, 210 in the second hard point, 5-2 overload. Nothing too different about this. Is there any chance that C9 can start winning respawns, or are you just giving up completely on that hope?
Oh, no. I mean, we talked about it indirectly when we were talking about C9 before Major 2, but there are other matches in these Major 3 qualifiers. They got LAT, Carolina, Falcons and Toronto. So I mean, maybe if Falcons are really struggling and Carolina is struggling, maybe Cloud9 can manage 2 and 3 and somehow sneak in, but that's probably like best case scenario for them at this point. But given what we've seen in the respawns, I think it's going to be very difficult for them. But they were able to pull off some upsets. Last set of qualifiers, I do think it's nice for them. They it is another 6-5, and whenever we last talked about Cloud9, we noted like the round differential. I don't remember the exact stat, but it was like pretty close despite their wins in S&Ds. It was like um they were like just slightly positive in terms of how many rounds of S&D they've won versus how many rounds they've lost, even though they've been winning games, and that just means they've played a lot of like 6-5, 6-4 games. Um I think it's good for C9 to not only win a search against Optic, but to do it on one of the new maps too. So that's good for them to continue and build on going forward. But yeah, I mean, this was really like we've talked plenty of times over the years about Optic having those series and past iterations of the team where it doesn't even matter if they lose the search because they're so dominant in the respawns. It's not necessarily how I view this Optic team, but for this match at least, like it's like, yeah, I mean, they did their thing in the respawns, and the search is just whatever. But I do think it's good for Cloud9 that they were able to get another search win against a good team on one of the new maps. We saw Optic being willing to play gridlock. I think that's probably one of the things people want to keep an eye on for Optic in particular, is how the map changes affect their map pool in particular, just because of Blackheart was seemingly one of their auto vetoes, so either one of the new maps just replaces it as their auto veto, or they try some of these new maps out and something else changes there for them. Um, so yeah, at least from that perspective, not a ton to talk about, but I do think, at least you gotta give credit to Cloud9 where you can, and there will probably be enough opportunities for us to just roast them and skip through their match pretty quickly. But in this case, I'll at least give them some credit for getting a good 6-5 win against a good team on one of the new maps.
It did seem like, especially in the overload, the Optic was like, all right, like this is pretty easy. Like the first half was pretty close, and the second half was like, all right, like we don't really need to take these guys seriously. I think Shotzi was like, every time he spawned, he's like, all right, I'm gonna flank, and that was pretty much the extent of his contribution, because he would just wipe out two, he'd die, and then he'd respawn. And he's like, all right, I'm gonna flank again. And Carolina was basically, or not Carolina, Cloud9 was effectively just like, where's Shotzi? Like, is he behind me again? And he's like, yes, he is behind you again. And that was kind of how the series went, at least from the respawn perspective. Pick 'em so far this season. Anything else before we get out of here?
We kind of skimmed over the Vancouver versus Carolina match, but
Okay.
didn't talk about it too directly. I don't need to go crazy about it because I know you mentioned the whole Nero thing, and we kind of touched on it, but really, like you mentioned, the respawns were close. 250, 233, map 1 hard point win for Vancouver. 250, 223, map 4 win for Carolina on gridlock hard point. But the difference here was it was literally 12-2, 2-6-1s in the search, and Gwyn had 9 kills on both of them. It's not a case where you say like, oh, it's two new teams in search here, and we've talked about that with other teams throughout the years, how like some teams most likely aren't practicing search a ton after they just form. So it's possible that had an impact here, but this was the match in particular I talked about earlier, where I thought Plaza showed out as a map that could get pretty mixy in terms of just being like super aggro. Um, at least in the early stages, and I especially there was another match. Maybe it was in I think it was the phase match I was just looking at. I don't remember, but there was other matches where it would have been the map 5. So maybe Plaza, as it stands right now, is this S&D map that's just like teams are willing to throw it into the map pool, but they don't want it to be map 2. They want it to kind of just be in that situation where like if they win the early maps, they don't have to play it. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But at least from this match perspective, I definitely think it was It jumped out to me how aggressive both teams were able to play, and obviously it favored Vancouver this time around. But I'm looking forward to seeing how some of the other teams will play on Plaza based on this small sample we got here.
Major three standings after the first week. We have four teams at 2-0, FaZe Vegas, Paris Gentlemates, Vancouver Surge, and Toronto Koi. Then you have LAT and Optic at 1-0, Cloud9 and Miami at 0-1, and then Carolina, Falcons, G2, and Boston all at 0-2. Obviously, this quite a long way to go in the qualifiers. Not as long as the major two qualifiers, we should say. So they're going to have to pick it up a little more quickly than some of the teams did back then. But pick 'em. You went 9-1 this week. I went 8-2. So you shrunk down the deficit. You are now at 98 and 54. I'm at 99 and 53. Tremor's gonna have to do a lot more work. He's 0-0, so he's still winless. So he's gonna have to pick it up. And I think that about does it. Please like, subscribe, follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, as well as YouTube. You can watch the live stream of the podcast on either YouTube or Twitch, twitch.tv/Ego Chall Podcast. You can also follow and subscribe to Bink on Twitch, twitch.tv/JBink with 2Ks. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at JBink with 2Ks, at Preston Byers, and the podcast tour is at Ego Chall Podcast. I do want to start actually posting on it a little bit more, like clips and stuff. So hopefully that'll start happening this week. It just depends on how motivated I am and how much time I have, but I believe there will be stuff on that Twitter for the first time in a while, and hopefully that Twitter won't be as dead as it is now. But yeah, next show should be Wednesday, but we always tell you to follow the podcast feed, and that'll give you a better idea of like when we're either going live or when the podcast feed's actually been updated and we have a new episode out. But yeah, usually Wednesdays and Sundays are our schedule, but we'll talk behind the scenes and see what we can do. And then we'll be back before then, of course, to talk about the minor, because that's coming up next weekend. We had a break off from the qualifiers. We didn't really need a break, but they're giving us one, and we're going to talk about the minor, and then we'll be back the following week to talk about the matches. And that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yep. Thank you guys, as always, for all the support. Really appreciate it. Just looking at the minor schedule for next week, though, it's going to basically feel like another week of online qualifiers, because I don't remember if it was 3 days for the minors last year. Very possibly could have been, but we got 4 matches on Saturday, or 4 matches Friday, 4 matches Saturday, and 3 matches on Sunday. So it's really going to feel like it's just, instead of 3-4-3 like this week, it's 4-4-3. So it's one extra match. But single elim, tournament style, should be interesting to see how it plays out. And there is a little extra money on the line, I believe. I don't remember if there's additional pro points on the line, because last year wasn't it only pro points for first and second?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
So I don't know if they're
no,
posts for,
I think it was top 4 got points, but only money went to the grand finalists.
Now the tweet for the COD League only says 20K for first for this one. It doesn't mention pro points or anything like that. So maybe we'll have more info on that for next episode. But regardless, I think it'll be interesting to see the minor format back in play, because it was something that both of us talked about at multiple times over the last couple months since it was implemented. And I think some people in the community definitely had the sentiment that they liked the format and wanted to see more of it. And even though we're not getting technically more minor tournaments this year as opposed to last year, we're getting them at a different point in the season. So the league's still trying to make some adjustments and figure out stuff format wise, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But yeah, like Preston said, we should be live again in a couple days to preview that, and then in a week from now to break down who wins minor 1 of the Black Ops 7 season. So hope you guys will tune in for all that. Looking forward to breaking everything down for you guys and whatnot. And yeah, until then, thank you as always, and remember to send the chow.